President Biden, he's going to deliver a farewell address to the country on Wednesday, and the White House says he's going to give the speech from the Oval Office. They haven't released the details about exactly what the president plans to talk about, but earlier this month, sources told NBC News that President Biden's final address would reflect his time in various political offices and will include a message to Americans about the country's future. And today, President Biden's going to deliver his final foreign policy speech from the State Department. The White House says the president will highlight his administration's efforts to restore America's global leadership, strengthen alliances, and address challenges like the competition with China and the war in Ukraine. With us now, let's bring in Deputy National Security Advisor Jon Finer. John, thank you so much for being with us. You know, we talk all the time about the data that's pretty straightforward when you talk about Joe Biden's economic record. Not what people are going to be saying today, but what they will say 10, 20, 30 years from now about an economy that's the envy of the world, jobless rates down at record lows, wages going up every year. We could go stock market at record highs. Obviously, it's not as easy to get those data points when you go into the field of foreign policy, especially when there are two wars going on that President Biden has worked so hard at ending over his last 4 years in office. Talk about what we should expect the president to say when he looks back over his legacy.
Well, thanks, Joe. You're right that foreign policy doesn't obviously and easily lend itself to numerical metrics when it comes to assessing it. But when the president lays out how we see the record over 4 years, what I think you should expect him to say is actually to tie our legacy in foreign policy to where you started, strengthening the United States at home, starting with our economy, our industrial base, our lead over the rest of the world in sensitive technologies that are related to our national security. That is a priority he set from the very beginning of the administration, and one that we believe he has very much achieved. Second, foundational aspect of our foreign policy. The president inherited, in addition to an economy that was stagnated, a set of relationships around the world that had atrophied, some of which had grown hostile with some of our key partners and allies. The president saw those relationships not as a burden on the United States, the way our predecessors did, but as a strategic advantage for the United States. And he went about repairing them, enhancing them in key strategic regions, principally Europe and Asia. As well as the Middle East. So when the crises that you referred to, obviously Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the Gaza, the Hamas attack, unconscionable attack on Israel, the United States was able to address those crises from a position of strength. And as a result, our adversaries and our strategic competitors, Russia, because it is now mired in Ukraine with enormous numbers of casualties inflicted by the Ukrainian army backed by the United States, and Iran, which tried to press its advantage on Israel after the October 7th attacks, those two adversaries have been left much weaker than they were 4 years ago. China, which many people were predicting was going to surpass the United States economically 4 years ago when we came to office, and technologically, those people are no longer making those claims because of the investments the president made at home and around the world. So we feel very good about the record, and the president will be laying that out.
And if you look at the adversaries, the people that see us as their enemies, not that who we see as our enemies, but countries who see us as their enemies. You're exactly right about China. They are facing a series of crises at home. You look at Russia. They are weaker than at any time since 2000, any time in this century. You look at Syria, gone. The Assad dictatorship, gone. And Iran, the epicenter of international terrorism since 1979. Iran so weakened that they don't even have any air defenses right now. You look at the people who consider the United States their enemy. Are they not weaker today than at any time over the past several decades?
So, Joe, I would agree with that. And I think a very important aspect of it is that the United States was able to achieve those outcomes without directly going to war ourselves. Because one of the things President Biden has also been committed to is not falling victim to the overcommitment of U.S. military forces around the world, which some of our predecessors he believed had overused. He ended the United States' longest war in Afghanistan. He achieved this strategic advantage over Iran by backing Israel, not by going to war ourselves themselves in the Middle East, and he is able to back the Ukrainians and bog down Russia, again, with these enormous numbers of casualties, without tilting that conflict into direct conflict between NATO and Russia. Similarly with China. We have pressed our advantage. We have pursued vigorous competition with China, but not allowed that competition to tilt into conflict, which would be bad for the United States and bad for the rest of the world. We have put guardrails on the relationship that have allowed us to continue to compete without destabilizing the Indo-Pacific or the rest of the world. And so, again, I think the record on these issues speaks for itself.
Well, I mean, and you look at the value. Let's talk about Russia. They're the world's. We are the preeminent military power across the globe. There's not a close second, but the second most powerful armed forces in the world come out of Russia. They have been gutted over the last few years, and they have been gutted without a single U.S. troop going to war there. Let's talk about NATO and also Asia, but let's start with NATO. And the extraordinary gains that this alliance that helped beat the communists and right now pushing back against Russia's aggression. Let's talk about the unprecedented expansion we have seen with NATO, especially in Sweden and of course Finland.
Yes, so Joe, NATO is not only larger, as you say, having added 2 new members and a 1,000-plus mile additional border that Russia now has to worry about. It's also stronger. You have many more countries, almost 3 times as many countries investing at least 2% of their GDP in their own defense compared to when the United States, when the Biden administration took office. So NATO is stronger than it was when we came, and it's also more unified. And that was not inevitable. If you had asked outside analysts in the context of a destabilizing event in Europe, like a Russian invasion of Ukraine, trying to essentially conquer Ukraine, would that be divisive for NATO or would that be unifying? It was not inevitable that it would be unifying, and it was in large part because of the investments the president had made before that invasion and since that invasion in holding the alliance together. The alliance has stepped up, it has backed Ukraine, and now as a result, heading into 2025, Ukraine is in a strong position on the battlefield economically, in part because of the use of Russia's own assets, which the United States has pioneered, giving Ukraine access to those assets to help pay its own bills at home, to pursue, should it choose to do so, an end to the war through negotiations. We have strengthened Ukraine's hands so that when the choice comes to Ukraine for how to end this war, it will be able to do so from a position of strength, and it will be up to the new administration to continue to strengthen that hand.
You know, John, we've been doing this show long enough that we've actually heard around the table 4 presidents and 4 administrations promise to take that pivot to Asia, which they've never taken until Joe Biden. And let's talk about that for 1 minute, because I think some Americans good number of Americans may have heard how NATO's expanded and what's happening in Ukraine. But a lot of Americans don't understand the investment in time and energy and resources that the Biden administration has done to stop China's aggression all around the neighborhood. You look at what's happened in Guam, what's happened in the Philippines, the commitment that Japan has made to rebuild their military, the strategic partnership between Japan and South Korea. You look at what's happening in Australia with our nuclear sub deal with Australia. Talk about the incredible work the Biden administration has done. My words, not yours, but I think the incredible work they've done in fortifying the United States position all around China and hemming them in, a very expansionist China, doing our best to hold them at bay.
So, Joe, it doesn't always get as much attention as a hot war in the Middle East or a hot war in Europe, but the foundational priority that the United States has placed on the Indo-Pacific region from the moment this administration took office is going to pay dividends for the country, not just in the near term, not just in the present, but we believe for decades to come. And there have been major investments made in that region, making real, I think, what several administrations have said they would do, which is place a priority on this most strategically consequential, economically consequential region of the world, in part by forming these diplomatic groups groupings and partnerships, enhancing our alliances with the Japanese and the Koreans, establishing for the first time a submarine and other security partnership that links our key European ally, the United Kingdom, with a key Asian Indo-Pacific ally, the Australians, the Quad, which is a grouping that involves seminal democracies in the region, India, Japan, Australia, elevating that to the leader level so that the key leaders of that region are sitting around the table talking about enhancing our collective strategic position. None of this is explicitly about the competition with China, but the backdrop of it, of course, is that the United States is enhancing through all of these steps and through increasing our military force posture in the Indo-Pacific, our ability to maintain the stability and prosperity that has characterized this region for decades and to increase the role and influence of the United States in it. Our allies feel more secure, more reassured, more comfortable, and the United States has more influence in this region than we have had ever before.
Deputy National Security Advisor Jon Finer, thank you so much. It's always great having you on.
Thanks very much.